Starting a little bit late today. We're scheduled 6:30 to 8:30, but we'll give Adam 45 minutes to an hour to present, and then we will have discussion afterwards. Of course, you're free to interrupt him. By way of introduction, I just want to say that this is Adam Hudson. He earned an MA in Philosophy, Cosmology, and Consciousness from CIIS here in 2007. He's currently pursuing his PhD candidacy in Social and Cultural Anthropology. His expertise in scholarship includes transdisciplinary pedagogy shaped by diverse fields, including Western philosophy, religious studies, feminist theory, post-colonial and subaltern studies, process metaphysics, deconstruction, philosophical anthropology, and integral theory. Better have some answers for us. Practicing applied advocacy research in the Tenderloin district of San Francisco, Adam's capacity to serve the homeless and working poor has developed around unlearning race and class violence. At Glide United Memorial Church, as both participant and researcher, Adam has done outstanding work organizing, facilitating, and leading multicultural and interfaith groups through anti-oppression work. Student of justice, empowerment, and living Western traditions, Adam's research is presently focused on the emancipation of social oppression in the Tenderloin district of San Francisco. Please welcome Adam Hudson.
Well-written introduction, welcome, CIIS, Interdisciplinary Dialogue Forum. Tonight, I want to talk about dissent. Not the kind where you go into hell, but the kind where you civilly disobey, where you speak truth to power. So, I think to begin, I'd like to take a few moments to center ourselves and to center myself and just have a few breaths. And I'm going to actually give just maybe speak a few words over us in the group to set the space. So take a deep breath. You can close your eyes or not. Put your feet on the floor in your waiting seat. It's with gratitude that we come to learn together and to be in one another's presence, to affirm one another with listening ears, with learning patience. Thank you. Bring your attention back to the room. I'm going to start with a reading from Herbert Marcuse. That hopefully will contextualize and help round out my talk. It's a good question. Where is the point that The constellation which prevails in the metropolis of capitalism, namely the objective necessity of radical change and the paralysis of the masses, seems typical of a non-revolutionary, but pre-revolutionary situation. The transition from the former to the latter presupposes a critical weakening of the global economy of capitalism and the intensification and extension of the political work, radical enlightenment. This is precisely the preparatory character of this work which gives its historical significance to develop in the exploited the consciousness and the unconsciousness which would loosen the hold of enslaving needs over their existence. The needs which perpetuate their dependence on a system of exploitation. Without this rupture, which can only be the result of political education, even the most elemental, even the most immediate force of rebellion may be defeated or become the basis of counter-revolution. The ghetto populations of the United States constitutes such a force. Confined to small areas of living and dying, it can be more easily organized and directed. Moreover, located in the core cities of the country, the ghettos form the natural geographical centers from which the struggle can be mounted against targets of vital economic and political importance. While it is true that the white man is guilty, it is equally true that white men are rebels and radicals. Like me. I'm a rebel and a radical. So part of my interest in Dissent was about coming from a recent issue of Ode magazine. Ode for Intelligent Optimists, very PCC. Welcome. And so I contextualized my talk in terms of dissent and the wisdom of one. And I was thinking, like, why does that interest me? You know, what's interesting about dissent? It sort of hit me, well, like, individualism is interesting. You know, it's very American. And so I thought I'd talk a little bit about, like, why I'm interested in individualism, why dissent is more probable with individuals than not. And so let's issues of freedom, democracy, and justice are pretty central to issues of dissent. So I want to talk a little bit about freedom in particular. A lot of people have had a lot of things to say about freedom, but generally, I think there's a framework that can interpret freedom in terms of just negative and positive. Negative and positive freedom, and there's thinkers associated with each negative freedom and positive freedom. So positive freedom is a little bit like a critique of negative freedom. Positive freedom says, you know, actually there are some things that are right and wrong, and relativism, which often negative freedom can be you can find is sort of relativistic, where this is a helpful image. Positive freedom is going to say that it's really about the end goals. Like, you start with something you want to do, and the how you decide you want to do it is because of the end goal. It's going to be a good goal, a solid, sound goal. Whereas negative freedom is saying, you know what, we don't really care about the goal so much. You can get misled by trying to get to something you can do. And it could be a little bit, you can have immoral ways to get to the goal that you want to have done. Negative freedom says, you know what, we just want the power to do what we want to do. We want the power to be free. So governments can just get out of the way. And so it's really concerned with not having C intervene or interfere with what you want to do. So there's different thinkers associated with each. Positive freedom, you can look to like Aristotle with notions of virtue. So you do something because it's virtuous, not because, and it's good to care for one another, because if you just leave everybody to sort of do whatever you want, then you can end up with some bad consequences. I feel like Rousseau, as a romantic, would insist that, it's not all about reason and just trying to focus on individuality and defining an individual. It's more, there are other things that come into making a decision, like intuition, feeling. Also Marx. and Freud to some extent. Each thinker, obviously, you can never rigidly confine them to a category. But how do you spell Freud?
E.
Did I spell it right? What is it?
Yeah, E-U-D.
Yeah. Thanks. Oh, all of you are here with me? That's great. That's great. I'm in a room full of people.
It's hard to spell on the board, but your handwriting is impeccable.
So, Marx and Freud, Marx going to say, it's like capitalism can end up being pretty bad situation. Exploitation of the poor. You get people who are alienated, and so you really need to critique a system that says that it's free for all, free market capitalism. And Freud, to some extent, as well, the subconscious is at work here, and just somebody pursuing their own individual freedom can lead to some pretty bad consequences. So we need to be attentive to what we do to get to a space, what we do to get to an end goal. With regards to negative freedom, which is, I think, what I want to concentrate a little bit more on tonight, with regards to dissent. John Locke really was a profound advocate for negative freedom, sort of defining, in many ways, from a sort of a natural state of a natural state. He sort of extrapolated a whole philosophy about human rights, freedom. We have the freedom to choose our destiny. Of course, Locke's influenced heavily Jefferson in the foundation of the American project. Also, can't talk about negative freedom without talking about a little bit about Thoreau. Thoreau, it's really important to be authentic. Without authenticity, we're not doing anything. And if if the laws are unjust, then you should be in jail. Come join me in jail, because the laws are unjust. He would say that things like materialism and conformity ruin the possibility of freedom, making rational decisions about how to engage the world. Civil disobedience, right? Actually, I want to say, I forgot to say, this is a context setting with regards to dissent. And then in a second, I'm going to go to a little bit of experiential or queering the discourse, if you will. Queering the discourse, and then I'll end with a little bit of a few antidotes, a few experiences. Also, Adam Smith, with regards to negative freedom, it's the free movement of the market, and let us be free subjects who participate in the market and who build better worlds. He would write in, I believe it's The Wealth of Nations, that each individual pursuing his own self, by only pursuing his own self-interest, promotes that of the welfare of the whole society. So even like Herbert Spencer, talking about social Darwinism. I'm spelling it right. My spelling has always been one of the areas that you could critique on my thinking. So, and then more importantly, I want to talk about Mill for a second, John Stuart Mill. John Stuart Mill, it's interesting, as I was reading and inspired by this Ode magazine, I realized a little bit later, it's like, wow, this is very John Stuart Mill-like. And John Stuart Mill has a book called On Liberty. And he talks about individualism. Why is it that we need people that are dissenting voices against the mainstream? So he sets up some thought experiments. So he says, what if the community is wrong and the individual's right? What if the community's wrong and the individual's right? What the hell? At that point, it's really beneficial for the community to be corrected by the individual. And you get people like Jesus and Socrates that fall into this. It's blatant examples of the individual being right where the community is wrong. And what happens, usually the people get killed. There's a reason why they killed Jesus. It wasn't because he was the Son of God. It was because he was pissing a lot of people off. The same thing with Socrates. You get claims of blasphemy, and he's making statements against the polis, against the state, saying, rhetoric is important. It's important to have dialogue. Corrupting the youth is sort of important. No, you can go to death. You die. And so there's another. So Mill's saying, that's important. Individuals dissenting is important in terms of that context, but it's also important in terms of what if the community's wrong, what if the community's right and the individual is wrong? If the community's right and the individual is wrong, well, then you just get a stronger society anyway, because the community has to then verify its beliefs. It has to stand itself up against the argument from the individual. If we fail to challenge our beliefs, they become based in dogma rather than reason, and that's really dangerous. So individuals challenge us to fortify and refine our right beliefs. So, so that's two ways that the individual and community sort of work together. But he also says that there's sort of this middle way, sort of where the community's right and the individual is a little bit right. So both sort of like have half truths and dialogue with one another to come out with a better society. And generally, that's what is happening on the whole. And I really like that. I like that because dissent is never happening from a vacuum, right? It's always in relationship to societal pressures, social pressures. And nor are those social pressures just random occurrences. They have agenda. And so in some way there's a mutual constitution that gives rise to events of dissent and to a community coming to reason with itself to be stronger, better, to survive. And I think I can't really go any further in a talk without situating myself to some degree. There's a reason why I like talking about dissent, because I'm an American. If I wasn't an American, I think maybe dissent wouldn't be so much of a forefront of my consciousness, of something to think about. And so I really reside in a space that's somewhere between the negative and positive freedom, because I'm using Marx to critique Smith. I'm completely proud of the Lockean inheritance of my own ability to individually choose a life. Like, I don't want the government to get in my way. It actually needs to get out of my way so that I can act freely and do things in the world. And in the same instance, I see that there's a lot of unconscious things happening. Maybe I don't exactly know what is the good, and oftentimes I choose wrong paths to get to a goal that I think is desirable. And it's good that we should care about one another too, which is much more on the positive side of freedom. I think we should take responsibility for our community and not just allow it to go wherever its rational choice would permit. Because I want to be a social dissenter, but I don't really want to upset anyone. And so that's a really difficult thing. And dissent is always a precarious issue because it's always for some worlds and not for others. It's specific and strategic in its effects. And only specific ideological intent is able. And as an American, I am conditioned by ideology, so who's not conditioned by ideology? But it positions me to really like to think and talk about dissent. And in an effort to queer this discourse, which is incredibly Western and Greek and Hebraic lineages both exist here. Queer it, racialize it, understand that there are other dynamics that make dissent a possibility in the world and in my own life. Dissent is close to me. I've had a number of experiences of dissent, which I want to communicate to you. Actually, before I leave Mill, I do want to read a little section. It's important to go to the original text and to see, to hear someone think. This is from On Liberty. It still remains to speak of one of the principal causes which make diversity of opinion advantageous, and will continue to do so until mankind shall have entered a stage of intellectual advancement, which at present seems an incalculable distance. We have hitherto considered only two possibilities: that the received opinion may be false, and that some other opinion consequently true, or that the received opinion being true, a conflict with opposite error is essential to clear apprehension and a deep feeling of its truth. But there is a commoner case in either of these, when the conflicting doctrines, instead of being one true and the other false, share truth between them, and the non-conforming opinion is needed to supply the remainder of truth, of which the received doctrine embodies only a part. So, in an effort to, I guess, queer, feminize, bring a critique to that perspective and situate myself, I want to interject Spivak's notion of strategic essentialism and Haraway's notion of, there's a word, interpolation. This is a good and important concept. That's right. So I find both of these terms to be pointing to a way of being in the world that mediates between negative and positive freedom in a really creative way. In instances, Spivak is really interested in subaltern studies, in post-colonial theory, structuralism. She's a deconstruction Marxist, if that makes any sense to anybody. And she is interested in giving power back to the powerless, and says as we need to be able to work together despite our differences. And she comes up with a concept called strategic essentialism, where it's basically putting aside differences to work for a common goal, especially a political goal. So we can be on opposite ideological ends in terms of whether we are more negative or positive in terms of our relationship to freedom, but we can come together despite those differences for a cause. You can get conservative Christians coming together with New Age liberals on the basis of ecological sustainability, and neither one needs. Both have an ideology that are so very different, but in terms of good idea. The world needs to be healthier. We can be stronger if we advocate for a healthier world. Doesn't matter what this other person thinks, because we can agree on this one thing for political achievement. And interpolation. I'm going to read a section from a woman named Donna Haraway, UC Santa Cruz professor. Is she retired yet? I'm not sure if she's actually retired yet. In the History of Consciousness program. She has this really great book. It's all about being a modest witness in a second Christian millennium. But she talks about to interpolate means to break in on, to interrupt a person in speaking or acting. The term also means to appeal or petition, to hell or to intercept, to cut off or prevent. It was used in the French in the 20th century as a practice in legislation to interrupt legislation to account to, like, we need you to talk about actually what you're saying. The tones here, interpolation then has several tones which resonate among French and English speakers. Their tones sound here in my warping of the French philosopher Louis Althusser's theory of how ideology constitutes its subjects out of concrete individuals by hailing them. According to Althusser, interpolation occurs when a subject constituted in the very act recognizes or misrecognizes itself in the address of discourse. Althusser used the example of a policeman calling out, "Hey, you!" And so when a policeman calls out, "Hey, you," if you turn and look at the policeman, then you are implicated in that discourse. You are a subject in that discourse. I'm a subject in the discourse of law and order. And so I'm subject to a powerful formation, Haraway writes. How I misrecognize myself. How will I miss or recognize myself? Will I be harassed by a dangerous armed individual with legal power to invade my person and community? Will I be reassured that the established disorder is in well-armed hands? Will I be arrested for a crime I too acknowledge is a violation? Or will I see an alert member of a democratic community doing routine police work? Whichever, all these ways that I am drawn into the helling, the interpolation, is mediated by the context of the situation, that the color of my body, the gender of my body. This concept and how it works in society so speaks volumes about unequal positions of subjects in discourse and about different worlds that might have a chance to exist. And the point, I think, is that I guess that I've experienced this to some degree. I've played with dissent, and I've experienced the power of being subjected to a discourse that you hadn't ever intended to be subjected to. So dissent is often, and often in instances where I have dissented, I'm an ally to some and not others. I'm choosing a world to affirm in dissent. Often dissent is about being an ally to the unrecognizable subject, where subject is sort of any entity. It could be an animal, it could be a rainforest, it could be a family or a state. I don't know if you guys have heard about the contemporary protest in Washington about the coal miners, the Appalachian coal miners who are protesting in Washington. There was two. There was at first a movement to protest the clear cutting of trees in the Appalachian region to coal mine, and then there was the protest of the coal miners who need deregulation who need, or their livelihoods depend on the deregulation so that they can clear cut the trees in coal mine. One of the most lucrative labor forces in an area that doesn't have a lot of money. And I think part of queering this discourse and part of feminizing it, part of interjecting alternative or post-colonial or subaltern lenses on freedom is to recognize, like, my own experience of that I show up despite my intentions. I show up as a body, in a body, a white, male, heterosexual from the U.S., as a Christian growing up, middle class. My body speaks before I've spoken in these ways. And this gives me power in some circumstances, and it interrupts my ability to be in others. So I'm going to give you a little an antidote. When a personal story, when I dissented, it was I had gone in. I don't know if anybody's heard this story before, but I was in a Best Buy. And I was just looking for some headphones. Actually, I bought these at Best Buy. And I'm looking for some headphones, and I'm just looking there, and it's sort of the stand-up position towards the front of the store. And I see this guy sort of passes by me hastily, and he's wearing this hooded sweatshirt, and he's sort of like a white male, 18, 19, 20. And he approaches the door, and I see behind me scurry two Best Buy employees, and I hear them, "Get that guy." and so they sort of like surround him at the entrance of Best Buy. So now he's standing there, and he's being questioned. And one of the employees, I'm witnessing all this from a distance. I'm seeing one of the employees pulls out an empty package, and is like, and I can feel the dialogue unfolding. You know, "Did you take this?" "No, I didn't take this." "Are you sure it's an empty package?" "We think you got this." "Are you sure you don't have?" "No, I don't." He pulls out a piece of headphones, and after a few minutes, eventually he confesses, "Yes, I'm the thief. I stole it." And you can feel the spirit of the. It's an intense sort of experience. I'm experiencing this from a distance and thinking to myself, "My God, man, just buy your headphones. This doesn't have anything to do with you. Just leave it." But I'm compelled. I'm interpolated, maybe, held, called out, and I witnessed about 7 Best Buy employees. It might have been 6. I'm not exaggerating. There were a number. Surround the guy in front of the door, and I walk up and I say, "So you caught a thief." I address them all. And this is what "So you caught a thief." And all of them, I do it with intensity and with authority. And all of them everyone is stunned by my description, and I would say, by the social descent of acceptable, acceptable public behavior. And they all are looking at me, and I look at the guy, and I say, "So you caught a thief?" And I look at the guy, and I say, "You need to leave Best Buy right now." And he looks at me like wide-eyed, and you can feel this. His spirit has he's been demoralized. His consciousness is bad consciousness, right? He's a thief. What a loser. And all the Best Buy employees, of course, are representing good and order and law, right? And responsibility to Best Buy. And so I what did I say? I said to him again, I was like, you need to leave Best Buy. And he sort of, and I saw it like with intensity, and he sort of got it, and he walked out the door. And now he's gone, and I'm surrounded by 7 Best Buy employees, and they're all looking at me like, WTF, man. And I'm like, and I say something to the extent I try to pontificate about, how we all have to recognize that we're the thieves. And we have to have grace. And how we have grace in a society like this. And that we all have to recognize that we're the sinners and the thief, and that grace is good. And at that point, I realized that I had no more power in the situation. And like all of myself, like all that intensity of rage that had sort of called me out and taken me into there had imploded, and I immediately walked away. And I was like, I'm just looking for headphones. That didn't happen, and I'm just looking for headphones. And so, of course, a couple of managers follow me over. They're like, you need to leave. And I'm like, oh, I need to leave? Why can't I just buy? Isn't that I'm here to buy? That's what you like, right? and they're like, no, you need to leave. And so it was interesting. They kicked me out at Best Buy. But I wasn't able to buy the headphones. And I said to the guy, I said, it's a shame. Best Buy seems to be doing really well. It's a shame that you would want to kick me out when I'm just trying to purchase something because, I don't know, you feel your authority is insulted or something. And I was like, isn't this the ass end of capitalism? Isn't this why we've had a problem with it? I left. I'm able to go back into the store. Hell, I bought these at Best Buy. So there's no memory, right? And I'm sure it was caught on tape. I would love to have that tape, but just because it's been recorded doesn't mean that actually there's a memory and that we can't get, because I'm able to go back into Best Buy and buy. But it's interesting because that sort of interruption is so very rare, and it's a form of dissent against social norms that's destabilizing. We don't want to see that. Don't we have police officers that regulate the right and the wrong for us? We've sort of outsourced our responsibility onto police officers and public officials to some extent. And so I'm going to read a passage from Anarchy in Action. And I like wearing this shirt because there's sort of this anarchic symbol. It's Armani Exchange. It looks like it's very anarchic. Police are expected to be bureaucrats of hostility resolution. But a society that visualizes the lawful response to disorder is an impersonal passive coercion that only invites terrifying outbreaks of police rioting. I'm not sure that was exactly important. Really decentralized power so that the individual has to deal with those around him in a milieu of diversity involves a change in the essence of communal control. That is, in the refusal to regulate conflict. For example, police control of much civil order ought to be sharply curbed. The responsibility for making peace in neighborhoods and neighborhood affairs ought to fall on the people involved. Because men are now so innocent and unskilled in the expression of conflict that they can only view these disorders as spiraling into violence until they learn through experience that the handling of conflict is something that cannot be passed on to the policeman. This polarization and escalation of conflict and violence will be the only end they can frame for themselves. This is as true of those who expect police reprisals against themselves, like the small group of militant students, as those who call on the police to be on their side. I left that situation from Best Buy traumatized. Even though I had this conviction that I had intervened in a really important way. No paperwork was filed. This boy didn't go to jail. maybe the Best Buy employees learned, I think there was one of the Best Buy employees who really got me. He was like, actually, I think what just happened was quite novel and affirmed. And he affirmed it. The two managers were really quite insulted because it was their power that I had stepped on. It was their moral ability to enact justice and responsibility for their store. So it had just been an insult to them. But the point is that, like, I went to a church group right after that, and I was telling them, like, I'm not sure if what I did was right. I'm really conflicted about this. It's residing resonance, there's a resonance in my body, pain. And I felt like I subjected myself to abuse. I felt like it was abusive to some extent. I was beat up. I got kicked out of Best Buy. I just want to buy a fucking pair of headphones. What happened? And so dissent is psychologically traumatizing. You want to be the one who speaks out against power. You have to risk the consequences. Maybe you might be, killed at 33 like Jesus. You might drink the hemlock like Socrates. You might be shot like Martin Luther King. Martin Luther King's approval rating upon death was about 72%, according to Cornell West last night. And so people didn't like him. Like 70% non-approval rating. He was not, people were like, this guy needs to tone it down a little bit. The balance of our whiteness is being disrupted. So you can die too, right? I mean, Martin Luther King, that's what happened. That's what we do to these people. So, and dissent is, it's not something I'm really advocating either, because it's bad often. It's just like, wow, that's just a dumb idea. Often dissent is like just bad ideas over and over and over. And, but then, there's also, I think Mill's pretty convincing when he says, yeah, we need those bad ideas because it helps us remember why we're believing what we're believing, which is good. It helps us the principle of falsification, and with all the positivists, an argument is made ever more stronger as it's consistently standing up against attempts to falsify it. I was going to talk about, just mention in passing a few of the points in Ode, which were incredibly, talks about the psychological consequences of dissenters, that they're alienated, criminalized, psychologized. They're categorized as being mad. They're not stable. They're crazy, and that takes a lot of internal strength to endure dissenting. That in some instances, it's argued that dissenters are some of the strongest people because they can endure the trauma of not being liked. And there's more and more studies that are coming out, a number of that are hit on in this article, that suggest dissent's even a good investment, because when you have dissenting opinions in a business, you're able to refine your thought, and you see more diversity in challenging one another's opinions. It flourishes perspectives, and that's really important, and that you can really get strong businesses if you have a dissenter in your midst. And now people try to make this up. Even there was, I think, in this, the Catholic Church would interpret, or bring in a devil's advocate so that they could help. The devil's advocate would help them remember why we believe in Jesus and why we believe in the Catholic Church. But often it was this superficial, they just brought in a devil's advocate to play this position, and really there's no change going to happen. So there's really something authentic about dissent, because it's antagonistic, and people lay down their lives for it. as I do work in the Tenderloin, and I consistently find myself there, I'm challenged by the inequality. And it gets to the point where you just want to be outraged. You just want to just raise havoc and abuse and raise your voice and do violence to those who think they're safe, because you want them to know that if we're not safe, then you're not going to be safe. And so we build containment zones around areas like the Tenderloin. But I experimented with my thought, like, what would it be to get a whole bunch of Tenderloin bodies together and do set-ins in the Apple store? Or, and say to them, we'll stop whenever you want to invest in us, whenever you, start giving an apple to the citizenry of San Francisco. And there's even lighter forms of this, is a conjecture, a thought experiment, but there's even lighter forms of this, like critical mass, riding critical mass, bicyclers dissenting against the hegemony of vehicles. Often it's like, well, you're just getting in the way, and it's like, no, actually, we are traffic, and you just are having to wait because we're traffic and powerful, and because we're in numbers. And so often dissent's shown up in marches and collectives that can demonstrate. It's a very safe way to be a dissenter, because then you don't have to worry, you're not individualized in the dissent. You always risk jail or death when you really truly dissent. And I think to some extent, come in. Okay. To some extent, dissent is politicizing philosophy. I'll say that again. Dissent is politicizing philosophy, making it both creative and sensitive, poetically acted and unafraid of death. That's drawing from, I think, a few of the former talks on philosophy, Sam's insistence that philosophy is something essential about touch. Maybe you wouldn't use the word essential, but touch is cool. Brings us recognizing that we're all approximate to one another. That dissent can happen out of a context of oppression, out of a social context, and that in some way dissent's sort of like poetic and addressing the denial of death to some degree. I think Jesus was prepared to die. He was not an idiot. He was aware that the actions that he was taking lead somewhere to death, to the cross. And a philosophy is the gadfly or the agitator, then dissenters are philosophers. Then and it's in many instances a refusal to be instrumentalized. If you're dissenting and you are risking the radical consequences of dissent, you're really betraying this capitalistic order of cost-benefit analysis. You're saying that actually I'll lay down my life for an idea, that even suicide bombers to some extent, Baudrillard talks about this, that suicide bombers find death as a superior, more authentic gesture or response to life, because it goes beyond the value of the system. In capitalism, all is based on the utility of change, utility of exchange, fair trade. Where a true gift, you might argue, is unrepayable. Can't have a return. It doesn't have an agenda. And I think in many instances, mourning, the act of mourning, tears, can be a dissent. I think I'd like to leave you with just the thoughts of dissent in your own life. I consider maybe having some sort of a dyad or a triad. I think we can just come together and talk, but I guess I'm just curious, where in your lives have you dissented? Where has it been a risk? When have you chosen not to dissent when you feel like you should have? And in many instances, like when I dissented at Best Buy, it was on behalf of someone I connected with. To some extent, I identified more with a thief and with that desperation and with that action than I did than I identified with the Best Buy employees. I wanted him to win. I chose a world. And so, what worlds are you choosing? Are you willing to risk calling out racist gestures? Are you willing to say, actually, that was misogynistic? Knowing that despite, even if the person of color or the oppressed person isn't there, that you will be allying with them in spirit. So I think I'll end with that. Let's open it up and talk a little bit. Yeah, thank you for listening and your attention. It's really quite humbling. I guess I have. Oh yeah, absolutely.
So hearing you talk.